The mare was trying to kill the boy when Ada Rourke stepped between them. One boot slid in the churned mud of the yard, manure and thaw water slicked beneath her heel, and still she caught the hanging rein, took the sting of the leather across her palm, and drove her shoulder against the mare's neck just long enough to slash the cinch free with the little bone-handled knife she wore at her waist. The saddle dropped. So did the animal's terror. It stood there heaving, sides fluttering, foam dark on the bit, while the ranch hand who had nearly lost his teeth to it stared at Ada as if widow's black was not meant to move that fast. She kept one hand flat on the mare's shoulder until the trembling eased. Only then did she look up. The man on the porch had not moved. Tall, spare, hat pushed back just enough to show the hard line of his mouth. He held a coffee cup like he had forgotten it was there. Nothing about him invited speech, and yet the whole yard seemed arranged around his silence. "If that boy lives to old age," Ada said, still breathing hard, "it'll be because somebody taught him a horse can't fill its lungs with a cinch pulled that tight." The rancher's gaze shifted to the cut strap at the mare's feet, then to the knife in her hand, then to the black cuff at her wrist. "What do you want here?" No greeting. No apology for the way she had ridden half a morning through Wyoming wind to stand in his yard. Ada sheathed the knife and lifted her chin a fraction. "My husband worked your north pasture through the early snow," she said. "Eli Rourke. He died in January. I was told any wages owing had not yet been settled." Something unreadable went through the faces in the yard. The boy with the nearly broken jaw looked away first. The rancher set his cup down on the porch rail and came off the steps slow, boots striking the boards with a hollow sound that carried farther than it should have. Up close, he looked older than she'd thought from the porch and more tired than any man with that much land had a right to look. "Any wages owing," he said, "were advanced through Dorian Pike in Rawlins. Your husband signed for them in November." Ada felt the cold move through her more cleanly than the wind had. "Pike. Of course it would be Pike. Smooth hands. Smooth smile. A way of talking that left you poorer before you understood you had agreed to anything at all. He signed drunk, then," she said. "That may be. And you paid a thief because the paper was tidy." One of the men near the water trough made a sound in his throat, half warning, half disbelief. The rancher didn't so much as glance at him. "I paid the man holding the contract," he said. "There was no cruelty in it." That made it worse. Ada looked once at the house behind him, white paint grayed by weather, front window curtained and never opened. She had told herself all the way from her place that if this failed, she would ask for work. Not charity. Work. But something in the level set of his face, the practiced way he had already made room for disappointment, closed that door before she could reach for it. So she nodded once, because dignity was sometimes only the shape you held while breaking, and turned toward the gate without another word. And if you're listening tonight while supper cools on the stove, or the house finally settles quiet around you, tell me where you're hearing this from. I've always thought stories travel better when they know which porch light or bedside lamp they're headed toward. Ada had nearly reached the gate when the rancher's voice came after her, low and steady enough to stop her where she stood. "Mrs. Rourke." She did not turn. "If you're leaving because Pike spoke first, that's too much power to hand a liar." The yard went still around them. Even the mare seemed to hold its breath. Ada turned then, slow, because anger she knew how to bear, but mercy had always been harder. "I didn't hear any truth from you." "Not yet," he said. "But I know that horse in my yard would have killed a green hand if you hadn't stepped in, and I know a woman who looks at an animal's breathing before she looks at the owner usually sees more than most men in a county office." He paused, and in that pause she heard the creak of the porch sign, the stamp of a hoof, the far metallic knock of a loose chain against a wagon tongue. "My housekeeper left last week to tend a daughter in Cheyenne. Calving started. The spring books are behind. I can offer room, wages, and 3 weeks' work. Long enough to learn whether Pike robbed one of us or both." The offer landed between them like something alive and easily startled. Ada ought to have said no. She had promised herself, promised over a still body and a Bible she could not look at without feeling cheated, that she would never again sleep under a roof owned by a man who could dismiss her with a sentence. But hunger made poor company, and so did the memory of the paper nailed to her door 2 mornings earlier, the one stamped with county ink she did not yet understand. "What's your name?" she asked. Something flickered at the corner of his mouth. "Jonah Mercer." She looked past him to the house again. No flowers by the step. No shawl draped over the rail. No second cup left out by habit. A house that had once held softness and had not trusted it since. 3 weeks, she said. That's what I said. I'm not washing your windows. Good, Jonah Mercer said. I've never cared if a view sees me clearly. The boy near the trough barked a surprised laugh, and then swallowed it when Jonah glanced his way. Ada did not smile. Not yet. She only nodded, once, and went back to her horse because agreement was one thing and trust another entirely. By sundown, she had ridden to the clapboard shack that had been hers for 11 months and her husband's for 6 before the fever took him. The wind had shifted north. Sage and old snow. The seizure notice was nailed crooked across the door, county stamp blue against cheap paper. Dorian Pike's claim sat beneath it in a careful hand. Debt satisfied by transfer of creek access and eastern pasture rights, pending confirmation. Creek access. Ada stood so still the cold reached her teeth. Water was not a side matter on that strip of land. Water was the land. Without the creek crossing, the place became a patch of stubborn dirt and memory. Inside, the one-room house smelled of ashes, lamp oil, and the ghost of sickness. She lit no lamp. She did not need it. Her body knew each board's complaint, each shelf's slight tilt. She went straight to the cedar chest at the foot of the bed and pulled out Eli's ledger, then the rolled deeds, then the envelope she had not opened because it had arrived the day after he died, and she had not believed there could be anything in the world more tired than her own name written on paper. It was from the county clerk in Rawlins. Hearing in 12 days. Outside, a wagon rattled past on the road and kept going. No one stopped. No one ever stopped unless they needed something. Ada sat on the bed with the papers in her lap and read until the last of the window light died. Eli's signature. Pike's witness mark. Numbers that did not sit right. Her husband had been many things, and in the final year more of them bad than good. But he had never mistaken east pasture for south, nor 20 head for 37. Drunk, yes. Careless, often. Illiterate, never. The world had just changed shape around her, and there was no path left through it that did not hurt. By morning she was back at Mercer Ranch with one trunk, one saddle, Eli's ledger wrapped in flour cloth, and the knowledge that if she lost the creek, she lost the last place on earth where anyone had ever called her wife. Jonah was in the calving barn with both sleeves rolled and berth slicked clear to his elbows when she found him. A cow strained in the stall, low and miserable, steam rising off her flanks. He did not look up when Ada stepped in. He only nodded toward the hook by the door. Hang your coat. Then come here if you've got the nerve. She set down her bag and walked straight to the stall. The calf was turned wrong. She knew it from the cow's laboring and the angle of Jonah's shoulder. You're fighting 2 front legs and a head, she said. I'm aware. You'll tear her if you pull like that. His eyes cut to hers then, gray and flat as creek stones. You know a better way? Ada stripped off her gloves, shoved her black sleeves to the elbow, and climbed the rail. Make room. For one long beat, he held her gaze. Then he shifted aside. The calf came 10 minutes later, wet and furious at the world. When it hit the straw and took air, the sound it made was raw and thin and beautiful enough to hurt. Jonah knelt there a second longer than necessary, one hand braced on the stall board, head bent. Ada turned away before she could see too much in his face. A person deserved that much privacy around relief. Mrs. Haskell keeps the kitchen, he said at last, voice back under control. Tom Lacey runs the outside men. Luis Ortega sees to the remuda. You'll help where you're useful. I expect wages each Saturday. You'll get them. And I want to look at every paper Pike has touched with your name on it. That time, when Jonah looked up, it was not surprise in his face. It was recognition, reluctant and exact, as if something he had been trying not to need had arrived anyway. All right, he said. That was how Ada Rourke entered the Mercer place. Sleeves wet to the elbow, boots in straw, the first living thing she helped pull safely into the world since she had buried the last man who promised her one. Mrs. Haskell was round as a wood stove and twice as warm once she had decided to be, though she did not decide quickly. She thumped dough with flour-heavy hands and watched Ada the way old women watch weather, with respect sharpened by memory. Widows black don't belong near a calving stall if you mean to keep it black, she said that first noon, setting a bowl of stew in front of Ada. Then it's fortunate I gave up on black staying black 3 months ago. Mrs. Haskell snorted. Good. Folks who insist on looking mournful clean usually expect someone else to wash up after it. Tom Lacey, the foreman, had a silver tooth that flashed when he doubted a person, which was often. Luis Ortega hummed before he spoke, as though words needed gentling in advance. The ranch hand Ada had saved from the mare answered to Ben Fuller and blushed every time he came near her, his right boot forever half unlaced. By the third day, Ada knew where Mercer kept his branding books, which cows favored which corners in weather, and which room in the house remained shut because no one yet had courage enough to open it. She knew Jonah took his coffee black and forgot to drink it hot. She knew he checked the north fence himself, no matter how much work waited elsewhere. She knew he had a way of pausing with one hand on a doorframe, just for a breath, before stepping into the kitchen at night, as if entering warmth still felt to him like trespass. And she knew, after 2 evenings bent over ledgers at his long oak table while the lamp hissed softly between them, that Dorian Pike had been robbing more than one household for more than one season. The trick was small enough to hide inside trust. Pike owned the stock scales in Rawlins. Mercer's cattle went through Pike's weigh station before shipment. Numbers shaved here, fees added there, advances recorded twice and settled once. Clean on paper if no one kept a second book. Jonah stood behind her while she traced a column with the blunt end of a pencil. She could smell cold air on his coat and horse on his gloves. "You ever tell him you thought the weights were light?" she asked. "Twice." "And?" He spread his hands and showed me the numbers. Ada tapped the page. "Numbers are only honest if the hand writing them is." His shadow moved across the table as he leaned closer. "Can you prove it?" "Maybe." She turned another page. "If your shipments match the rail receipts, and if my husband's ledger lines up with the dates, and if Pike's vanity stayed stronger than his caution." Jonah was quiet. "Then, your husband kept notes?" "On good days. And on bad ones." She kept her eyes on the page because grief had 1,000 disguises and anger was the one she wore best. On bad days he made promises with ink he couldn't honor sober. Jonah did not say he was sorry. She was grateful for that. Sorry was cheap when given to widows. It asked them to carry the comfort of the person offering it. Outside, the night wind rubbed the cottonwoods together with a dry, whispering sound. The lamp warmed one side of Ada's face. The other stayed cold. She had not sat at a table beside a man after dark since Eli died. She had not noticed until that moment how loud the clock sounded in a quiet room, or how steadily Jonah Mercer breathed when he was trying not to crowd a person. "Your choice is eastbound," he said after a while. "Take your wages at week's end, board the train, let the land go. That's the easy path. It's the safe one." Ada set down the pencil. "A person can go hungry a long time on what they're owed." The words were plain enough. That was why they stayed in the room. Jonah looked at her then, really looked, the way a careful man checks the sky before promising anything about weather. "And the hard path. Fight him at the hearing. Lose if I must, but not by staying ignorant." He rested one hand on the chair back opposite her. Strong hand. Scar along the thumb. A rancher's hand, square and used honestly. "If you fight Pike, he'll make it ugly. It already is. You don't owe your dead husband that kind of public loyalty." Ada's mouth tightened. "This isn't for Eli." No answer came for a beat. Then Jonah said softly, "No, I expect it isn't." The next days tested them in inches, which is how most hard choices arrive. A heifer went down in the south pasture, and Ada rode with Ben through sleet so fine it needled her cheeks raw. Jonah gave her the driest horse without remark and took the meanest one himself. Mrs. Haskell discovered Ada could make biscuits that did not disgrace a table and became, from that hour, almost kind. Luis put a rawhide bowsaw in Ada's hands and watched, saying nothing, while she gentled a 3-year-old bay by touch and patience rather than force. Jonah saw that from the gate and said only, "You learned that where?" "From my father. Freight mules first, then horses. Animals breathe easier when they know where your hands will be. People too, sometimes." She looked at him. He was studying the bay's ears. By the end of the first week, Tom Lacey no longer hovered when Ada checked the branding book. By the second, he brought her the freight receipts before she asked. Men trusted competence slower than they trusted swagger, but longer. The world beyond the ranch noticed too. In town, the shopkeeper's wife looked at Ada's flour and coffee purchases, then at the black band still tied at her throat, then at the Mercer account book in her hand, and arranged her mouth into that thin line women used when they had already carried your story around to 3 porches before noon. At Pike's office, his clerk tipped his chair back and smiled as if widowhood made a woman fair game for amusement. Pike himself received her standing by the window, one thumb tucked into his vest, sunlight on the gold watch chain across his belly. "Mrs. Rourke," he said warmly, "you're looking better than the last time I saw you. Grief must be easing." Ada kept both hands on the ledger she had brought, because striking him with it would have been satisfying, but unhelpful. "I've come for copies of my husband's advances. Those papers are not yours. They concern land with my name on it. They concern debt with your husband's name on it. And he's dead." Pike sighed as though she had become tiresome by choosing facts. "Exactly. Which makes all this unpleasantness unnecessary. Sign the creek transfer. Take a settlement. Start over somewhere green and forgiving. Is that what you tell yourself this county is?" Ada asked. "Forgiving." His smile thinned a hair. "I tell myself it belongs to people strong enough to keep what they hold." She laid the Mercer freight receipt on his desk, then one of Eli's ledger pages beside it. The same date. Different numbers. Pike glanced down and then up, expression hardly shifting at all. That was the dangerous thing about him. He did not spook. Men like that could keep harming people because they never wasted effort looking guilty. "Careful," he said mildly. "A widow can damage her own position badly if she mistakes scribbles for evidence." Ada gathered the papers before his fingertips could touch them. A liar can do the same when he mistakes a widow for a loan. The clerk had stopped rocking his chair. When she stepped back into the street, wind blew red dust down the boards and stung her ankles above her boots. She stood there a moment, heartbeat high, the town loud around her in ordinary little ways. Hammer on tin, mule bray, laughter from the barber shop, a baby crying somewhere upstairs over the mercantile. Life had gone on while she buried a man and nearly lost a creek and learned the weight of one rancher's silence. It angered her. It steadied her too. By the time she rode back to Mercer Place, the sun was dropping, copper through the cottonwoods. Jonah met her by the corral. "Well, he's either calm because he's innocent," Ada said, swinging down stiff-legged, "or because he spent years practicing fraud and calling it business." Jonah took her reins. "Which do you think?" "I think snakes don't hiss when they're sure of the grass." He almost smiled. Almost. That night, after supper, he set a small packet on the table beside her plate. Survey copies, old grazing maps, rail tallies, more trust than he had yet said aloud. Ada looked at the papers, then at him. "You keep handing me pieces of your livelihood," she said. "You keep returning them in better order." It was near enough to praise that Mrs. Haskell, darning a sock by the stove, made a soft approving noise through her nose and pretended not to hear. 3 mornings later the space for quiet choices collapsed. Tom rode in at a lather with news that Pike's men had posted notice at the South Crossing. Mercer cattle would be denied water access pending settlement of the Rourke debt. No court order yet. Just Pike moving faster than decency, betting no one would stop him before law bothered to wake. Jonah swore once, low and clean. They moved at once. Saddles, canteens, coil of rope. The air had that bright, sharp look Wyoming sometimes wore before trouble, all blue sky and hard sun, as if the country itself preferred honesty and left people to fail it on their own. Ada rode with them to the crossing and found Pike already there, coat off, shirt sleeves neat, boots polished enough to insult the mud. 2 hired men stood by the gate post. A new chain looped through the latch. "This is temporary," Pike said when Jonah dismounted. "Just prudent stewardship until the hearing." "Of water that isn't yours," Ada said. Pike glanced at her, patient as a man explaining sums to a child. "Of water attached to debt your husband failed to satisfy." Jonah stepped between them before Ada could speak. He did not raise his voice. Men like Pike preferred shouting. It let them pretend the louder party had lost reason. "Take down the chain." "No." "Then say plain in front of witnesses you mean to let calves go thirsty before a county clerk has ruled." Pike's gaze flicked to Tom, to Luis, to Ben perched pale on his horse. Then back to Jonah. "You choose dramatic wording too often, Mercer. The stock can drink north. North won't hold them all. Then perhaps you should have managed your spring numbers better." Ada heard her own pulse in her ears. Pike wanted anger. He wanted rashness. He wanted Jonah to break first, so the story in town would tell itself by supper. Jonah looked at the chain, looked at the cattle bunching in dust behind the riders, balling sharp with thirst. Looked at Ada once, and in that glance she saw the whole hard choice. Force the gate and turn a theft into a legal dispute, or back down and let Pike squeeze them by inches until even winning later would cost too much. Jonah took one slow breath. Then he said, "Turn the herd north." Tom stared at him. "Jonah, do it." Pike's smile came almost too fast and disappeared just as quickly. He had won a piece and knew better than to celebrate before decent people. The herd moved badly. Too crowded. Too hot. Ada rode the flank till her thighs shook, dust caking on her teeth, calves crying for mothers in thin, frantic voices that frayed her nerves one thread at a time. North Pasture bought them a day, maybe two. No more. At dusk, when the last head finally settled, Jonah sat his horse on the rise above them all and looked older than the sun-bleached timbers of his own corrals. Ada rode up beside him. The evening smelled of trampled sage and hot leather. Far off, a meadowlark kept trying to make something hopeful out of the hour. "You could have broken that chain," she said. "Yes." "And given him exactly what he wanted." "Yes." She looked at him. "Do you always choose the harder road?" "Only the ones I can still live with at the end of the day." The word stayed with her into the night, through coffee gone bitter on the stove and the dry ache behind her eyes from too much dust and too little sleep. "And let me ask you something here. While the gate is still closed and the worst of it hasn't yet broken open, when trust has failed a person more than once, what do you think brings it back? A grand promise, or one small decent choice made where no one gets credit for it? I know what I believe, but I've heard good people argue it both ways." Before dawn the storm came, though not from the sky. Ben burst into the yard bareheaded and wild-eyed, one suspender hanging loose. North fences cut. Everything after that moved fast. Boots on boards. Horses snorting clouds into the dark. Tom swearing around a bit strap. Jonah shoving a rifle into a scabbard and never once checking whether Ada meant to stay behind. He knew better now. They found the herd spilling through the broken line toward the ravine country east of the creek, black shapes flowing in low moonlight, hooves hammering earth hard enough to shake it. A stampede never sounded like thunder to Ada. Thunder rolled. This was sharper than that, frantic and splintered, like a world cracking in pieces under too much weight. "Fan wide," Jonah shouted. "Turn the lead cows if you can. Don't crowd the drop." Ada drove left with Luis, the gelding beneath her stretching flat and sure. Wind cut tears from her eyes. Dust rose thick enough to taste like blood. A heifer broke near her knee and she leaned low, voice steady, hand firm, giving pressure then release exactly as her father had taught her on half-broke freight stock when she was too small for the saddle and too stubborn to wait. You don't fight fear head-on. You bend it somewhere survivable. That was true of animals. True of people too, though people took longer to admit it. They nearly had the front of the herd turning when one steer hit loose shale at the ravine edge and went over in a crashing slide of rock. 3 more shoved behind it. The line bunched. Panic rippled backward. Jonah spurred straight for the choke point. It was madness and precisely right. He got ahead of the lead cows, horse braced, hat gone, shouting with a force Ada had not heard from him before, not loud for anger, but loud for life. The herd wavered, broke around him, flowed left. Tom and Luis caught the flank. Ben, white with fear, held where Ada shouted for him to hold. Then Jonah's horse stumbled. Ada saw it and felt the world narrow. One bad step, one shoulder down. Jonah pitched half out of the saddle, hauled himself back by the horn, and kept the horse under him by something fiercer than balance. But when the last of the cattle had turned and the noise began to thin, he stayed bent forward over the neck an extra second. She reached him first. "Where?" "Rib," he bit out. "Can you breathe?" "Wouldn't answer if I couldn't." That, more than the words themselves, told her how much it hurt. Dawn came gray and mean over a pasture trampled to ruin. They had saved most of the herd, lost 4 head over the ravine and a 5th later with broken legs. Pike's men had done their work cleanly and in darkness. No witness, no proof. Only a cut fence and a county already tired of hearing decent people complain about wealthy ones. Back at the barn, while Jonah sat on an overturned bucket stripping off his torn coat with slow, careful motions, Ada took up Eli's old saddle to cut fresh latigo for the damaged tack. The leather was stiff from disuse. She had brought it because selling it felt like treason and keeping it felt worse. When she pulled the worn lining free near the cantle, something thin slid out and hit the floor. Not paper, a slate sliver. Pencil marks pressed deep. Ada crouched and picked it up with fingers gone suddenly cold. Brands, dates, head counts, Pike's yard notations, Mercer shipments among them. And in the margin, cramped in Eli's unmistakable hand, one sentence scratched so hard it had almost cut the surface. He says Mercer never checks the rail receipts. God forgive me, I think he's right. Ada sat back on her heels. The barn smell rushed over her all at once. Hay dust, liniment, warm manure, metal, old grief. Her husband's hand. Her husband's shame. Not innocence, then. Not clean victimhood. He had known. He had helped, or at least kept silent long enough to be used. She closed her fist around the slate until the edges dug her palm. Jonah had come up behind her without sound. What is it? Ada looked up. For one wild second she wanted to lie. To say nothing. To tuck the slate into the fire and let Eli remain, if not a good man, at least a private failure. The dead could not defend themselves. The living always paid for their sins aloud. It's his hand, she said. Jonah waited. He knew Pike was shaving your weights. Her voice roughened on the words. Maybe from the start. Certainly by the end. The pain that crossed Jonah's face was not triumph. That would have been easier to bear. It was something sadder. The look of a man having an old suspicion confirmed and finding no satisfaction in being right. Can it prove enough? He asked. Maybe not in court by itself. But with your receipts, with the survey lines, with the chain at the creek, she swallowed. It proves Eli was part of it. Jonah leaned one shoulder against the stall post because his ribs would not allow much else. Ada. She stood so fast the bucket beside her tipped. Don't be kind to me about him. I wasn't going to be. Good. He said nothing more. That mercy nearly undid her. By afternoon, Pike's next move arrived in the form of a deputy with a paper naming Mercer cattle in unlawful use of disputed land and requiring appearance at the hearing the following morning. Pike had done what men like him did best. Turn harm into procedure. All day the question hung over Ada like heat over rock. Use the slate, and the whole town would hear what sort of man Eli Rourke had been in his last months. Hide it, and Pike might keep the creek, the scales, the polished smile, the power to go on thinning other people's lives by ounces until there was nothing left but hide and bone. At sunset she carried the slate to the porch and stood there while the light drained off the pasture. Jonah came out slow, one hand pressed low to his side. You should be lying down. I've done enough of that in my life. She looked at the slate. Not at him. He wasn't always that man. I know. No, you don't. You know the end of him. There were years before that. Good ones. She heard the pleading in her own voice and hated it. There were mornings he made coffee before dawn because he knew I liked the smell of it first thing. He carved me a spoon once from box elder because I'd said offhand I hated tin. When the roof leaked, he stayed up 2 nights mending it. He was not. Her throat closed hard. He was not only what he became. Jonah stood beside her in silence long enough for the first star to show. Then he said, most people aren't. She turned then. If I use this tomorrow, that's what they'll remember. Not the spoon. Not the roof. Not the man before the bottle got hold of him. Jonah's face, for once, had no shelter in it. If you don't use it, Pike will count on you loving a ghost more than you love the truth. The porch boards creaked under her shift and weight. Somewhere in the dark a calf called once for its mother and quieted when answered. I don't know if I can survive hearing them speak of him like that, she whispered. Jonah's gaze stayed on the pasture. You can. The certainty of it made her angry. How would you know? Now he looked at her. Because some wounds, when pressed, stop being private whether you consent or not. The truth came into his face before he could school it away. Ada saw then what sat behind the shut room in his house, behind the pause at the doorframe, behind the careful distance with which he handled every kindness. My wife died in the fire in that west room, he said quietly. Not because I wasn't here. Because I was. There was a storm coming in from the north, and the bay stud had gone half mad in the lower barn. I chose wrong first. Went for the horse, thinking there'd be time after. By the time I got back, the room was smoke and heat and boards dropping. Folks in town remembered for years what I saved before I remembered her. Ada did not move. I could spend the rest of my life telling them what else I was, he said. Wouldn't change the part they're right about. The world seemed to hold still around them. Even the cottonwoods quieted. What was her name? Ada asked. Clara. He said it like a thing he had not allowed himself often. Ada looked toward the dark west wing of the house. I'm sorry. So am I. There it was. Not cheap sympathy. Not the easy sorry strangers handed widows in town. This one had cost him skin. They stood side by side while the dark settled fully. Then Ada opened her hand and looked at the slate one last time. At dawn, she said. Jonah nodded once. They did not sleep much. Ada lay awake listening to the house. Old timber contracting in the cold. Mrs. Haskell coughing once in her room and settling again. Wind nosing at the eaves. Somewhere down the hall, a floorboard under Jonah's step. Then another, then quiet. The sounds of a place keeping itself upright through the night. Morning came bright and pitiless. The hearing room in Rollins smelled of dust, ink, hot wool, and too many bodies forced into civic righteousness. Pike sat at the front polished as a sermon. The county clerk looked already tired. Two ranchers Ada did not know leaned against the back wall. Mrs. Haskell had come in her best hat, brim pinned with a pheasant feather sharp enough to count as moral support or a threat. Pike's attorney spoke first. Debt, transfer, lawful stewardship, widow's confusion, Mercer's trespass. All the tidy language by which greedy men turned hunger and thirst into numbered paragraphs. Then Ada stood. Her knees wanted weakness. She denied them. She told it plain. Eli's illness. The papers. The wrong numbers. The rail receipts Mercer had kept by habit. The scale tallies Pike controlled. She laid the slate on the clerk's desk and heard, somewhere in the room, the intake of breath that comes when a private lie becomes public fact. Pike did not interrupt until she said Eli's name and fraud in the same sentence. Careful, Mrs. Rourke, he said smoothly. You dishonor your own husband with desperate invention. Ada turned to face him. The room felt hot as a forge. Her mouth tasted of pennies. No, she said. I dishonor you. It was the first time his calm cracked. He rose. That slate proves nothing but the grief of an unstable woman. Before Ada could answer, Jonah stood, one hand braced on the table because his ribs still hurt him. He did not look at Pike. He looked at the clerk. I checked my rail receipts this morning against every shipment in my ledger for 18 months, he said. They match her claim. And if the county wants another opinion, ask Harlan Voss out of Laramie. Pike shaved his weights too. Voss sent me word last week he just found it. That was the earned turn, small and devastating. Not rescue from nowhere. Just the slow loop of truth closing because dishonesty had grown careless and honest men had finally begun comparing notes. One of the ranchers at the back pushed off the wall. He shaved mine as well. Then the other. Mine too. Pike looked around the room and, for the first time since Ada had known him, found no firm place to put his confidence. The clerk called for adjournment pending formal audit. Temporary control of the creek reverted until judgment. Mercer cattle restored access. Pike's private station records to be seized for review. Not final safety. Not yet. But the shape of power had changed. When they stepped out into the street, the noon sun hit Ada full in the face. She wavered. Mrs. Haskell caught her elbow with a grip like iron tongs. Breathe first, the older woman said. Fall apart later. I'm not falling apart. Then do it prettier than most. Jonah came down the steps a moment later, pale under the tan of his skin. Pike brushed past them without looking right or left, moving quickly now, as if speed alone might make him seem less seen. No one stopped him. No one called after him. That, more than shouting ever could have, made him smaller. Back at the ranch, the quiet after the storm settled in strange. Not peace. Not yet. But tenderness had room again. Jonah's ribs had begun to purple clear through his side. Ada found him in the tack room after dusk, trying and failing to buckle a strap one-handed. She took the leather from him without comment, set it aside, and pushed him onto the bench. Shirt off. He looked up. That sounded uncommonly like an order. It was. He obeyed with the wary dignity of a man and used to being tended. The bruising spread dark and ugly from midrib to flank. Ada clicked her tongue once, more softly than Mrs. Haskell ever had, and laid the cloth in warm water. The tack room smelled of saddle soap, worn hide, and the cedar chest where old harness was kept. Outside, the barn lantern knocked gently in its hook. Ada pressed the cloth to his side. Jonah hissed breath through his teeth and then stilled. You can cuss if you like, she said. I prefer not to waste good words. There speaks a man who doesn't know many. That got the ghost of a smile. She re-wet the cloth. He watched her hands. Strong hands, though narrow. Needle pricked in the fingertips. Scar at the base of the thumb where a kitchen knife had slipped years before. Widow's hands. Yes, but more than that. Working hands. Staying hands. You saved the herd, she said. We saved the herd. You stood in front of 800 frightened pounds and called it a plan. 1,200 on the lead cow. Ada shook her head. Vain. His face sobered. How are you? It was such a plain question that she nearly lied from habit. Then the room, the hour, the smell of warm leather and clean pain, the raw honesty of the day behind them, made lying feel childish. I feel, she said carefully, as if I buried my husband a second time in front of a full room and had less kindness for him in the telling than I expected. Jonah's gaze did not leave her face. And how much kindness did you expect? Enough to make me look better than I do. She wrung out the cloth, watching water darken the floorboard. I loved him. I hated him. I pitied him. I resented him for dying before he had to answer for anything. There are days I miss him hardest for the man he was before he went weak, and there are days I'm only grateful the bottle can't take another year from me. Jonah took that in without flinching. You don't mend a torn thing by pretending it never ripped, he said. The line settled between them with the weight of something both simple and final. Ada's hand stopped. He went on, quieter. What you said in that room today didn't take the good years from him. It only refused to let the bad years keep stealing from you. For a long time neither spoke. Then Ada crossed the few inches still left between them and rested her forehead, very lightly, against his shoulder because it was the smallest honest thing she could think to do. He did not move, not at first. Then his hand came up and hovered once at her back before settling there, broad and careful and warmer than she had prepared for. After a while she straightened and pulled something from her apron pocket. It was the box elder spoon. Jonah looked at it, then at her. I kept this and not much else, she said, because it proved he had once made something gentle with his hands. I don't need proof the same way anymore. She turned the spoon once in her fingers. I thought maybe your shut room could use one small ordinary thing in it when you're ready. He stared at the spoon as if it were made of memory and flame. Ada, you don't have to thank me. His throat worked once. It wasn't thanks. He took the spoon with the same care he might have used lifting a newborn calf or a frightened bird. Then, after a silence that felt like trust approaching on cautious feet, he reached into the shelf above the bench and drew down a little object wrapped in old muslin. Inside lay a brass key on a faded blue ribbon. Clara's sewing room, he said. West door? I haven't opened it in 4 years. Ada looked at the key, but did not take it. Why give it to me? Because you were right the first day. He breathed shallowly against the bruised ribs. A house ought to be used for living. This is the part of a story where a good many of us feel something loosen that we didn't know we were holding. If that's you, press like and subscribe for me. Not for numbers. For the promise of more stories that remember tenderness is not weakness, and that quiet people carry whole worlds inside them. Ada accepted the key. The next morning, she opened the west room. Dust lay over everything in a soft gray skin. A narrow bed, sewing basket, bolts of faded calico, a cracked china cup on the sill. Light came through the curtains thin and gold, and the room smelled closed but not dead, as if time had only stepped outside for weather and meant to return. Ada did not tidy it all at once. That would have been violence of another kind. She opened the window, shook out one cloth, set the box elder spoon in the cup. Then she left the rest for another day. Her moment of restraint came before supper, in the yard, with witnesses enough. Tom Lacey had received word from town that Pike's books were worse than anyone guessed. Missing entries, duplicate liens, quiet thefts folded through half the county. Mercer, as the principal complainant, stood fair chance of gaining temporary claim over the South Crossing management until the matter resolved. You ought to take it all, Tom said, silver tooth flashing. His station, his contracts, every stick you can lay paper to. Ada stood beside Jonah by the water trough, the brass key still warm in her pocket. She could, if she wished, press her widow's claim hard. She could ask damages, public apology, perhaps even enough land concessions to salt Pike's pride for a decade. Part of her wanted that. A bruised part. A lonely part. Instead, she said, I want the creek restored, the debt voided, and the record corrected. Nothing that isn't mine. Tom stared. Mrs. Haskell, shelling peas on the porch, did not lift her head, but Ada saw the older woman's mouth soften. Jonah looked at her then with a depth that made her pulse unsteady. Not admiration exactly. Something quieter. Recognition, perhaps, of the line she had chosen not to cross. Warmth entered the house after that, though the world still watched. Pike had not yet been ruined. He still had men, money, and the stubborn vanity of those who cannot imagine a county learning to do business without them. But by the week's end, ranchers were driving stock to a different scale 30 miles north rather than trust his yard. News traveled by fence post, feed store, quilting frame, church step. He had not been destroyed. Worse for a man like him, he had begun to matter less. Mercer Ranch changed too. Jonah stopped pausing at the kitchen door. Ada's black dresses gave way, one ribbon at a time, to brown work skirts and a blue calico Mrs. Haskell claimed happened to fit after very little alteration and far too much gossip. Ben quit blushing every time Ada entered a room and started asking sensible questions about horses. Luis taught her a Spanish prayer his mother used over sick foals and never told anyone he had done it. The West Room aired. The curtains moved again. Mrs. Haskell pretended not to notice. When the county's final ruling came 3 weeks later, it arrived on a clear morning with larks lifting from the pasture and the smell of coffee strong enough to bring the whole house honest. Debt voided. Creek restored. Pike's liens suspended pending broader investigation. Mercer vindicated in the weight dispute. Pike barred from county-scale contracts until audit concluded. Not fireworks. Not cheers in the street. Just paper, signature, seal, and the plain heavy sound of truth finally landing where it belonged. Jonah read the ruling once, then handed it to Ada. Well, she agreed. Mrs. Haskell cried first, though she denied it by blaming onions not presently in the room. Tom slapped Ben hard enough between the shoulders to stagger him for no reason except joy needed somewhere to go. Luis removed his hat and hummed under his breath, which Ada had learned meant gratitude too deep for speech. Pike came out to the ranch that evening alone. That surprised everyone but Jonah, who had understood from the start what sort of reckoning best fit a man like him. Not public collapse. Not dramatic begging. Just the lonely errand of a person arriving late to the truth and hoping there might still be a chair left unbroken. Pike stood in the yard with dust on his polished boots and no place to rest his hands. The sun was low. Cattle moved dark and slow beyond the corrals. Ada stood on the porch, Jonah below her. The county will continue the audit, Pike said. No greeting this time. I expect I'll lose the yard. Yes, Jonah said. Pike swallowed once. I came to say I misjudged the matter. Ada almost laughed at the elegance of it. The matter. As if theft, thirst, and widowhood were weather. Jonah spared him by not forcing the word apology out into the open where it would only humiliate them all. You misjudged people, Jonah said instead. Pike looked at Ada then, truly looked, and whatever he saw in her face made him lower his eyes first. Mrs. Rourke. That was all. No excuse. No plea. She could have taken more from him in that moment. Could have laid out his sins one by one and watched him carry them home in public. Instead, she only said, "The county will keep its own books now." Pike nodded. He left with dignity just barely intact, which was more than he had protected in others, but less than he'd once assumed was his by right. By winter, he had sold his interest in the yard and gone south to Denver, where perhaps polished men still mistook smoothness for substance. In Carbon County, people weighed stock elsewhere. Mercer Ranch entered summer like a place relearning its own name. Ada moved from the spare room to the west room by her own choice, and only after a long quiet talk with Jonah on the porch steps under a sky white with stars. She turned Clara's sewing room into something living without erasing the woman who had first loved it. Her needles went into Clara's basket. Her apron hung beside the blue ribbon. The box elder spoon stayed in the china cup by the window. One evening in late July, while the hay fields smelled green and sweet and the men were still out with the final wagon, Jonah found Ada sitting on the porch rail with her boots off, feet in her stockings resting on the lower board, tired clear through. He stood below her, hat in hand, as if the last few months had taught him courage in every matter except this one. "Your 3 weeks ended some time ago," he said. "I had noticed. You've not said whether you mean to leave." She looked out toward the meadow where the cut hay lay in windrows gold as old coins. "I've not said because I wasn't sure whether being wanted and being useful were the same thing here." He winced as if she had touched the bruised place directly. "They're not. No, no. He drew breath and seemed to brace himself against something harder than pain. Useful is a good horse. Useful is a sharp pencil and a steady hand in calving season. Wanted is, he stopped, started again. Wanted is the sound of your step in the hallway before breakfast. Wanted is the way this house stopped feeling abandoned when you opened one window. Wanted is catching myself with news at the end of the day and realizing I've kept it to tell you. Ada's heart gave one hard, frightened beat. He looked at his hat brim, then back at her. I can offer partnership in the books and a fair share if that's all you'll have. If it isn't, his voice lowered. If it isn't, I would ask for more, but I won't ask by trapping you with gratitude. She set her boots aside and stood, still above him by one porch step. Jonah. He went very still. I don't know if I've got any right parts left for being easy. Something like pain and hope crossed his face together. Neither do I. Ada reached out and touched the scar along his thumb, the one she had first seen beside the ledger lamp weeks before. That may make us well matched. His laugh came quiet, rough with relief. The kiss, when it finally arrived, was nothing like the breathless nonsense girls and dime novels were promised. It was slower than that. Older. Better. The kind built out of withheld things and surviving. His hand at the back of her neck was careful until she leaned into it, and then not careful at all in the ways that matter most. When they parted, the meadowlarks had gone quiet, and the last wagon was rattling in from the field. Mrs. Haskell saw them from the kitchen window and thumped the spoon against the pot with unnecessary force. Neither of them minded. The first frost came early that year, silver on the grass before sunrise. By then Ada's name sat in the Mercer books in a hand as steady as any contract. Ada Rourke Mercer, partner by marriage and by land, because Jonah had asked properly in front of God, Mrs. Haskell, Tom Lacey, and a preacher who cried more than the bride. Months later, when the snows had gone and the creek ran full again from mountain melt, a little girl from town whose mother had died in childbed came often to the ranch for lessons in the West Room, because Ada could not bear the thought of Clara's sewing table holding only dust forever. The girl, Ruthie, had a front tooth missing and a habit of reading words twice as if tasting them. Jonah built her a stool. Mrs. Haskell pretended the extra biscuits she baked each Thursday were miscounts. One evening near the end of April, with the cottonwoods just beginning to green and the air carrying that cold, sweet smell of thawed earth, Ada stood at the kitchen window shelling peas, while Ruthie sounded out a passage by the stove, and Jonah came in from the lower pasture with mud to his knees and a new foal tucked alive against his chest. He set the little creature down in the straw by the door, and it unfolded itself all legs and wonder, while Ruthie laughed, and Mrs. Haskell declared the kitchen a barn with walls, and Ada laughed too, the sound startling her only because it came so easily now. Jonah crossed the room, kissed the flower from her cheek, and said, soft enough for home and loud enough for life. Some lives come in looking half lost and turn out to be the truest thing under your roof. And through the open window the creek kept flashing between the cottonwoods as the whole house glowed gold around them. Next time, I'll tell you about the schoolteacher who arrived in a mining town with one suitcase and a false name, only to discover the man building her classroom had buried a promise he never meant to break. Until then, take gentle care of your heart tonight.